Concrete in itself is not a bad material. It just, we use so much of it. It's the most widely produced material on Earth besides, water treatment. At some point, I think around 2020, we crossed the threshold, which is somewhat scary, that we have more inorganic material that we've produced than there's organic material on the Earth.
Welcome back, future ancestors, to another episode of Fostering Our Earth, the podcast where we explore what our sustainable future can actually look like. In each episode, we sit down with experts and leaders who are on the forefront of leading us to the sustainable future. That clip you just heard was from Luke Lombardi, a structural engineering and sustainability professional talking about embodied carbon. Embodied what? Embodied carbon. It's the carbon emissions that are associated with the materials and construction processes that go into building the world around us. Now, we often talk about the operational carbon emissions. So that's like the emissions that come from living in your home and all the various appliances that you use, like your heater or your stove. But what about all the emissions and the energy it took to make your home, such as the bricks or the steel beams or even the appliances themselves? Embodied carbon is the emissions generated from extracting, manufacturing, transporting, and constructing all those different building materials. It takes energy to make anything, so just about everything has embodied carbon, even the chair you're sitting on or the phone that you're using. I think embodied carbon is super interesting because while we can discuss how one material is better than another, glass versus plastic, we can zoom out to reflect on the idea of consumption. How much of things we consume in the first place, and what it means to be sustainable in our practices. Now, reducing embodied carbon is crucial for mitigating climate change. And of course, there are different technological solutions that we'll touch on in this episode, but we'll see that the tech really isn't here to save us. We need better policies and need to change our relationships with the things that we use and own and consume. For this episode, I'll be joined by Shika Srinivas as my co-host, and we'll learn from Luke about what exactly embodied carbon is and why it matters. And so without further ado, let's just jump into it. So Luke, thank you so much for joining Shika and I on Fostering Our Earth. I'm so excited. We're both so excited to catch up with you and learn from you. We have so many awesome top things we want to talk about today. And Shika, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll pass it over to you Luke, to just introduce yourself to everyone listening.
Awesome. My name is Shika Srinivas. I am a sustainability consultant at Arup, where I've been working for about 2 years now. And one of my primary first tasks at Arup was working on an embodied carbon report related to the Natural Resources Defense Council and trying to figure out what building materials to prioritize for advocacy in reducing embodied carbon. So excited to circle back on this topic and learn from Luke, who I know has been working in the field for a while. And for more context, me and Awe met in the master's program at Stanford, the Sustainable Design and Construction program, and have stayed friends and collaborators since.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm super excited to be here. Awe, we know each other from work, and I've been a listener to the podcast, and Shika, very nice to meet you. And I'm just always excited to get on my little soapbox about embodied carbon. So looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, without further ado, we sort of hinted at it a little bit here and there. Shika mentioned embodied carbon and Luke's expertise in this space, but let's just start with that. Like, for folks who are new to this space and sustainability, what is embodied carbon and why is it important? Like, why do we care about it?
Yeah, so embodied carbon is something, it might have a bit of a branding problem, not the most intuitive term, but for me, it's all about the relationship to the material world around us. And it's about having a holistic view of thinking about everything from the concrete that you're walking on to the steel that's going into buildings. Where did that material come from? All the way from the minerals being mined to the end of life of when those resources are no longer useful. And embodied meaning like it's inherent in the process. To get steel or to get concrete, there's material manufacturing process that takes place out of sight and out of mind, somewhere far off. So we don't often think about it. But as we've started to think about it and uncover this blind spot in sustainability, we realize actually these material processes are hugely impactful, right? You think about steel needing to be melted down, or cement being heated up in a clinker process. And the emissions from these are actually quite significant. 8% of global emissions come from concrete, 11% from of all our built environment, and the like in comparison, like all of aviation is like 2.5%, right? Like it's a lot, it's not small things. And it's really about like that relationship and understanding upstream and downstream effects of our built world. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, I'm getting the idea that it takes energy to create anything, and emissions come from the creation of everything, which I think is kind of funny because we don't really think about the energy that went into creating, you mentioned like the sidewalks that we walk on or the chairs that we sit on. And then I guess moving up into different industries. One thing I remember from Stanford, we took this class, life cycle analysis. We all took this class. And in that, we talked a lot about embodied carbon when considering life cycle analyses and thinking about products and industries and materials through this sort of assessment POV. Could you explain like what that is and maybe what that relationship with embodied carbon is?
Yeah, life cycle analysis is kind of the cornerstone of how we quantify these emissions. So it takes data from manufacturers, and as you say, it's almost like you got to like link together things. We've gotten pretty good at understanding when we flick on a light switch that really we're also kind of pulling that energy from a coal plant or renewable solar. And so it's sort of one step further beyond that. So when we order concrete for our project sites, that's getting, coming from a plant. And then that plant is pulling energy or emitting carbon in some way. And so life cycle assessment takes environmental product declarations. And here we get into like all these, there's the alphabet soup of embodied carbon, but basically those are nutrition labels for products. So you might have a cubic yard of concrete. It could be something like 500 kilograms of CO2. And to put it in perspective, it helps to have like equivalency factors sometimes. So I did a quick calc once, and when you see a cement truck, or not a cement truck, a concrete truck driving around, that's about 10 cubic yards of concrete. And if you were to plug that and use an average environmental product declaration, that nutrition label, it's about equivalent to driving the length of California. So one of those cement trucks, it's quite a bit of emissions. So on the building scale, what we're doing is basically an accounting exercise of gathering all the materials that in our project, attributing those to line item by line item to those different material emission factors, and then summing it up to get an equivalent carbon number.
That is baffling.
Yeah.
I'm just still processing the cement
I mean,
truck
it's surprising
being
when
equal.
you just like, it's something we don't think about because we're one step removed, right? And I think it helps to look at through this lens and really think about how much material we do use. Like concrete in itself is not a bad material. It just, we use so much of it. It's the most widely produced material on Earth besides, water treatment. At some point, I think around 2020, we crossed the threshold, which is somewhat scary, that we have more inorganic material that we've produced than there's organic material on the Earth. So like we use a ton of this stuff, and it has the manufacturing of cement in particular, which is a kind of the binder, the main product of concrete, is very intensive. It takes high temperatures to melt limestone. Like you're literally melting limestone. And we actually, just last week, we took a field trip, the Carbon Leadership Forum, local hub in Los Angeles that I co-lead with a number of other awesome folks. Took a field trip to the Cal Portland's Mojave plant, the cement plant out there. And it's just eye-opening to see this in person. You get a better understanding of, how the materials around us are made. Like they have a quarry, and they have, like, I knew conceptually that you have to heat this rock up in basically a big oven, but they have, it's called a kiln, right? It's heated up to almost 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and they put this limestone there, and it literally becomes liquid, like magma. And then that's how our cement is made. And to power that kiln, you need both coal and natural gas. So you think about it, it's almost like its own little coal power plant, right? And it's, in California, we don't even have any coal power plants anymore. So like these things are necessary to create a product that in today's world, like we can't get away from using concrete. We use it everywhere. It's highly necessary for our built environment. And so it gets to the point where you're like, okay, we know we can't do what we're doing now, and there's lots of folks working on innovative solutions or ways of recycling, but it's like that relationship with both the built world and all of the people who are responsible for that coming to being in our lives, like to make the world around us.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for diving especially into concrete, which I know has come up so much. And I'm just looking outside of my window at all the concrete pavement in the parking lot behind our apartment building, so it's very easy to see. Are there any other particularly high embodied carbon impact or
Concrete's a great one, and there's a ton of research going out there of how to decarbonize that, both from an energy standpoint and as well as the other part of the chemical engineering process of concrete is there are emissions that are even removed from the energy side, and we can move towards renewables as much as we want, but like that we still aren't even getting towards those emissions. So lots of really interesting research that, let me know if you want to dive into any of those novel cements. We can definitely get into that. Besides that, the next biggest kind of carbon emitter is definitely steel. And again, for me, it's fascinating where it's like, yeah, to learn about, it's like, you ever watch that show, How Things Are Made or How Things Are Built? I forget what it's actually called, but it's kind of that like interesting engineering process that I'm sure you have some nerds out there who dive into this. But steel is basically produced, and this is an oversimplification, but either from a basic oxygen furnace to make you take raw ores and coal and you make virgin steel, or there's an electric arc furnace which takes recycled scrap steel and you basically melt that down. That's the very simple way of putting it. In both those processes, even the highly recycled content, like in some ways steel is touted as a highly sustainable material because it is so recyclable, but even that takes a ton of energy. So, and it requires that recycled stock of steel, right? So, the first step of moving away from basic oxygen furnaces, and the good news is in the US, we've basically, like, there aren't so many of those. We are largely transitioned. I think we're 67-70%, like there aren't that many mills, but we're mostly electric arc furnace. But globally, that's the opposite. There's actually a lot more basic BOF furnaces that are making virgin steel. So for procuring steel for a project in California, and we're getting steel from China, there's a decent chance that is coming from a higher carbon. It's about twice the carbon of electric arc furnace. There's also interesting research on moving away from how do we make low carbon virgin steel. So really interesting stuff into like green hydrogen power and electrolysis, things that there are experts who are spending their whole career working on those, right? And that's the other thing that I really love about embodied carbon is there's a level of humility to it where it's like you're never going to know everything. So a lot of it is just being curious and trying to connect with people whose life work is a cement plant or developing new solutions for steel. So those are the two biggest. I mean, facades also, like thinking about insulation, thinking about aluminum and glass, those are also pretty energy intensive process. And yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts I'd actually love to hear the NRDC report that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think you captured a lot of the materials we talked about in that report, which were concrete, steel, aluminum, glass. And this was something that came up in discussion too that we didn't really include as much in the report, but an area of more research are HVAC systems and all the energy systems, especially as we're thinking this kind of intersects with the work you were talking about, Alway, when we're thinking about decarbonization and replacing to, water heaters and doing the things necessary for electrification. What is the impact of that and all of these materials? There was also kind of an internal study about next uses for old fossil fuel equipment and how we with the embodied carbon that it took to make all of those materials, what can we still do with them? And so that's kind of going into the upcycling and circular economy side of things. But yeah, I think you captured the main ones from
We'll
what I remember too.
definitely have to get into this, talk about the circular economy stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, the whole topic is fraught with blind spots. It's like before, when sustainability, like when I was in school, before y'all were at Stanford, the sustainability was all about operational, right? Like that was almost synonymous. And this topic of embodied carbon wasn't even on the radar. Like I think we talked more about embodied water when I was in undergrad than embodied carbon. And now there's good research from the CLF. They just did a benchmark report for California that include operational and embodied life cycle assessments. And the majority of emissions is actually coming from embodied carbon, largely because we've made a lot of progress on both electrification and renewable energy. So these upfront emissions from manufacturing today that are getting emitted and will be in the atmosphere for a century, it's more than even what we're doing on the like efficiency kind of building MEP side. But the other thing I was going to say with that though, on like the thread of it being fraught with blind spots, is there are systems that we aren't even looking at right now. Like we have understand pretty well the structural and enclosure sides of things. So my background's in structural engineering. Like I feel like most folks have heard that concrete's pretty intensive, steel is intensive. We're pretty good at estimating those. We have, pretty decent data at this point. But then you think about like, there's tons of other things that come in a building, like mechanical systems, refrigerants, interiors is something that like we don't have our heads wrapped around like quantifying so much, and can really add up because there's so much replacement over the life of a building. So definitely a work in progress in a number of areas that I think will be a career's worth of interesting rabbit holes to go down.
All right, folks, Awe here. It's been a pretty technical opening section of the episode, so I just want to jump in and summarize things to this point. Luke explains that embodied carbon is the carbon emissions associated with the entire life cycle of building materials, from the extracting and manufacturing of raw materials to the disposal of them at the end of their life. He highlights how materials like concrete and steel, which are essential to our built environment, have massive carbon footprints. For example, concrete alone accounts for 8% of global emissions. 8%, that's so much. In fact, one of the craziest facts that he shares is that we've crossed the threshold of having more inorganic material that we've produced than there is organic material on Earth, just to give us a sense of how much we're actually creating and producing. Luke breaks down the concept of life cycle assessments, LCAs, which are a tool used to measure the environmental impact of the materials that we use. The conversation then shifts to how cement gets made with his recent visit to a cement plant. He describes how limestone is heated to nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a kiln, and this requires significant energy from coal and natural gas. The key takeaway is that industrial processes like these, just to get the materials we use to build everything, is very energy and emissions intensive. Next, we'll continue the conversation about the scale of how much we're building and introduce the concept of adaptive reuse and where that fits into all of this. Yeah, and honestly, one reason I think I'm so fascinated by the idea of embodied carbon and sort of also like life cycle analysis or assessments is sort of its interconnection with just systems, or like, the philosophies of like, what does sustainability really mean, and thinking about our footprint on this planet, and like getting to the ideas of, Shika mentioned upcycling and reuse, and we focus so much on the operational stage, but thinking about what goes into creating, and then what happens afterwards, what happens after with the materials and the products that we've created. We build our buildings, or we have all this existing infrastructure, and when it comes time to if we're either transitioning to a cleaner future, or where we want to we talk about reusing buildings for different purposes, or do we just build new buildings? Like, what about the existing embodied carbon that went into this? Does it make more
Yeah.
sense to reuse it? And as we talk more about sort of like ultimately, like we're here thinking about how do we reduce the embodied carbon in building projects, And so could you talk us a little bit about what some of the strategies are to reduce the embodied carbon in building projects, whether they are the actual, materials and or like trade-offs between, better designed, from your structural engineering background, is it better designed? Is it, reuse? How do we reuse these different materials, and like, do we, I know there have been projects. Yeah, I'll let you talk about it. My mind can keep going.
No. I mean, I totally agree. And so it gets me riled up too. And I mean, I think part of it is there's so much, because this is relatively new, people looking at, there's so much potential. Like we're doing so poorly that there's a lot of room for improvement. Like just generally the building industry, can be somewhat notorious for being slow to change. There's a lot of high risk. And then for that reason, there's a lot of conservatism baked in as well, right? But like you said, we know we're going to need to continue to build more. There's some projections, there's some statistics out there that folks may have heard. It's like by 2060, we're projected to double our building stock. So everything in the world around us is projected to get built again, right? Globally, we're talking in a global context here, right? It's like Paris every month. Like that's the scale. And a lot of that is happening, maybe not in the US, but it's a lot of building. And actually, one thing that you taught me, Awe, was the relationship. There's an interconnection with climate change as well. And thinking about, displacement and migration, like, I mean, those projections are just guesses, right? We don't actually have a real good sense of, that could be exacerbated by climate changes and some of the things that building actually contributes to, right? So what we know is we need to find better ways to build, right? And I think it's all of the above of what you said, right? Like there's some level of, just challenging the status quo of what's getting built, of, how much do we need to build and of what? So something that's a hot topic right now is a lot of adaptive reuse. So thinking about how do we leverage in a post-COVID world where the city of Los Angeles, I just found this out, has like 30% vacancy in office buildings, and it's rising. Can we leverage those buildings and utilize the carbon investment, if you will, to tackle some of the community housing needs? And there's some really good work being done by folks like Giving locally who do a lot of adaptive reuse. And one of the saw a presentation recently that I was really inspired by, of just like there's a level of creativity to meet these demands that I think is really interesting and exciting, and it resonates with people. So we need to reimagine what we can do with those buildings. And in general, I think that also takes like on the back end as well, of like what happens when we decide the building is no longer useful. There's the circular economy, which Shika already brought up a little bit. That's another reimagining, right? Like right now we just send a ton to landfill, right? I should have looked up the statistics, but I think, we send as much, if not more, building, construction, and demolition waste than all of municipal waste. So everything that you or I throw in the garbage bin, we're throwing away more buildings. If you think about the demolition of a building, it's a huge scale of materials that go into that. And if you drill into like singular human scale, if you think about it on the scale of a house, like choosing to demolish and build a new house versus retrofit a house, it's something like, you throw away 5 pounds or something per day. And it's, if you aggregate that up over your lifetime, it's about how much your house weighs. So if you're tearing down a house, like, we shouldn't just be sending those resources to landfill. We should be capturing what's useful and trying to reutilize that. And so there's some really interesting ordinances like across the country. I think Portland might have been like one of the first one, but they're like these deconstruction ordinances. I think, in the Bay Area, there's, Palo Alto, and I feel like there's another city up there, but it's being recognized that there's value in these elements, and we should focus on trying to salvage what we can and create a marketplace for those reused materials, both from like a carbon perspective, but also it's just like it's there are other negative health and like climate consequences of sending stuff to landfill as well. So that's kind of the circular, like the reuse side. And then on the design side, which is my background where I come from, there's certainly like efficiency is a huge piece. Working with architects to come up with efficient systems, and even, I mean, I'm hopeful that in the next decade or so we can move towards even like more hyper efficient. A lot of the way we build now is driven by cost and schedule, right? Like those trump everything in our world, and it leads us to making inefficient material choices because labor is so expensive, right? Like if you look back at a building, Michael Cropper at TT, an old colleague of mine, had a nice study where he looked at a building in DC that was built in the 50s and a building that's built today. And all the buildings today are these flat plate concrete, right? And so it's a solid mass of concrete because it's the fastest. You have a flat form and you pour to that. And if you look at the building that was built 50 years ago, it was more common to use these like ribbed systems. So you have voids. So it's significantly more material efficient, but it takes time to build that, right? And so you have this like trade-off, and we certainly have room to do better and work towards more efficient systems in that way. I'm not sure we have like the economics of that fully in our grasp, but that gets to another bigger question, which if you want to go in a digression that way, happy to. And then the last kind of, okay, so we have circularity, we have design efficiency. I mean, another aspect is like just the technology side of things. I think there's a number of really exciting advancements in concrete, like novel cements, or like I was mentioning earlier with the steel, with the electrolysis, and like there are these kind of aspirational zero carbon materials, carbon storing materials, but I'm a little bit more hesitant on these, right? If anything, I think what we found from this is there's no panacea. Like there's no one way we're getting out of this. Like I think there is a mixture of solutions that really requires bringing diverse perspectives together, getting everybody at the table to kind of make these potential reductions. That was probably way too long-winded.
Oh, that was great. That was great. And I like even sort of the breaking it down between circularity, design side, and even the technology. Because I think we have a lot of fear, or there's a lot of faux optimism, and that technology is the way to go about saving. That's what will save us. But it's kind of scary to put our hope in that, especially when there are other options we have there, and thinking about circularity and reuse, adaptive reuse, and sort of these ideas you're talking about.
It's actually it's like that whole nuclear fission thing. It's like nuclear fission always 10 years away, right? Like they would solve everything, but it's not here yet, and is a dangerous line to toe of like that optimism that delays action. And one of the things that I would like to influence or put out there the most is that there's just so much for us to do today, and that there, beyond carbon too, there's lots of benefits of doing it today. Like we shouldn't rest on our laurels. Like we should kind of take these things that people have done elsewhere. There are folks capturing these solutions and applying them on projects, and any project could take a benefit from this lens.
Yeah, that's super helpful to remember that there's a kind of a timeline of action, and there are certain things coming long term, but that doesn't stop what we need to be doing today to make that long term possible. But yeah, speaking of kind of actions that we can take today and policies that you see supporting, embodied carbon regulation or the reduction of embodied carbon, can you speak to some sort of the policy landscape around that, and some of the organizations and legislation that are helping drive some progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that is particularly interesting right now, and something I'm finding myself talking about a lot is the policy side of things. It's one of those things that takes it's definitely a longer arc of change, right? But a huge lever that we have. And it's interesting right now because we're seeing kind of a pretty significant shift. There hasn't been embodied carbon it hasn't been regulated, or, there'd been no significant policies to, until recently. And that's really developed in a few different, like it's shown up in a few different ways. The first that folks might have heard or been aware of is BuyClean. BuyClean California, I want to say, was it was voted on and approved like 2017-ish, and it was slowly phased in. And I think it's CLF too that has a nice diagram of like it started in California, and now there's a number of other states that have adopted it as well. And that slow phasing in of like first California required, said they were going to do it, and then they said you're going to need to develop EPDs by a certain date. And then they said, okay, we're collecting EPDs and we're going to start setting a very high limit. And then now it's like limits have been set. And and I should have said too that, so BuyClean sets a performance limit on different materials. So earlier I mentioned like a cubic yard of concrete would be, just throwing out a number, but like 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. It's saying we're going to take all this data and set a limit of minimum performance, right? And the idea behind that is to encourage, through policy, manufacturers to decarbonize, right? Like if your material doesn't meet that limit, then obviously that's quite kick in the butt to kind of get into gear and see what you can do to meet that limit. And it started out with just public projects, so just like government projects as a first step of kind of adopting. And now it's continuing to expand and to build. And one of the most exciting things that's happened in the last year is the CalGreen embodied carbon code requirements, which was formally adopted in July of this year. And it targets both public and private projects over 100,000 square feet, non-residential, and schools over 50,000 square feet. And it gives 3 pathways, which are kind of like a framework of decarbonization. One of those pathways is the BuyClean pathway. So it says you can meet the minimum requirement by meeting a performance level criteria. The next pathway is whole building life cycle assessment. So proving reduction through completing an LCA on your project. And the third pathway is reuse. So if you use at least 45% of the existing building, then that is also a way of meeting the performance requirements. And I mean, this is really exciting because it's California is a state level. It applies to Stockton as well as San Francisco, right? So you're bringing like a much broader group to the table. We're saying this is the path, and it includes kind of some higher tiers that indicate, where this path is also headed. But that being said, because it's a state level policy, it's fairly conservative to start. Like it's a low bar. And I think similar to what we've seen in BuyClean, that will continue to be more aggressive as we move forward. But it's definitely caused a lot of discussion in the industry. A lot of people are like, if you haven't heard about it yet, like you're starting to hear about it now, and potentially have projects that are impacted by it. So that I think has been really positive. A lot of the groups like behind that have been AIA, really spearheaded that. A guy named Mike Molinowski, wonderful human being. I was a part of a small group with other folks from New Buildings Institute and RMI and SEOC, kind of a collective. And it was a really interesting experience for me because as a practicing structural engineer, I've basically no insight into the political world. Like it's totally opaque to me. So having someone like Mike who kind of understands the process was really critical to kind of moving this forward, and having a lot of stakeholder engagement and talking with, builders to contractors to developers, material orgs, like everybody. It was really critical for moving that forward, and very excited about that. Other policies, I mean, I've talked a little bit about the deconstruction ordinances that have popped up elsewhere, low carbon concrete ordinances. I think there's some incentives in like New York and New Jersey. There's some codes, and I know Santa Monica also just passed a low carbon concrete policy. The original was actually in Marin County, which is also adopted, I want to say around 2020. And the big thing for that though is I think too, I've been reflecting on this a lot where it's, policy is only as good as the implementation, right? And like the to some degree, there's like this human instinct to be like, yeah, I want this low carbon, zero carbon concrete, and then I'll be good. Or yeah, I just have to like, just do adaptive reuse. Or yeah, just like once we have policy, it'll just be required. And I just feel like every step of the way, it's like it's true, but it's also like actually, it always comes down to us implementing, and it really comes down to the people. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of now that we have this CalGreen policy and it's, the talk of the town, then the next question is like, oh, but what about, practitioners need to be skilled. What is a baseline? So I gave a presentation with Laura Carnath and Rochelle Habshi are both like co-leaders of the local CLF hub with me. And it's like, so much of this comes down to the agency and like what we're willing to do and like communicate and educate and share with other builders and contractors. It's like even with this policy, it's only as good as us like actually implementing it. Again, I don't know, maybe that's way too long-winded, but
No, you're right on the money. And what as you're explaining this, it makes me think, there are different. I read a book called Fire and Flood by Eugene Linden, and it talks about there are different like climate clocks. It's like there's like the scientific, like the reality clock of like the pace at which things are actually changing. There's like the scientific clock, which is like how quickly our science is like keeping up with the changes that are actually happening in reality. There's like the maybe a public opinion or like a political clock. It's like our reaction to the science, and then how long it takes for that to like go into a bill to be passed or a policy to be developed. And then there's like our response to that, which is once a bill has or a policy has been in place, like how long till the changes are actually being affected. And when we're talking about the built environment, like buildings are designed, our built environment stuff isn't designed to last a year or two. These are we designed them with like 50-year, 100-year timelines, and like the stuff that we're building now, hopefully is going to last for, however many decades. And so like the policies we're implementing, whether it's like a low carbon policy here or a reuse policy there, like I think those really, they set the tone for, whatever building is built, immediately following that, like it's going to last for another however many decades. So like it matters. These policies really like dictate what our future looks like, and it's important that we keep efficiently advancing all this progress that we're hopefully trying to make.
Yeah, I will say always has the best book recommendations too.
Yes, I've taken advantage of many of them myself. We actually did like a book club podcast
Yes,
for fostering
and
our
that'll be
Yeah,
coming
that's
up too.
awesome.
Yeah.
Amazing. But yeah,
Yeah.
you're totally right, Awe. It's like if this thing is gonna last a century, like is it really the right way to think about it that we can't handle a few months schedule delay because uh XYZ reason, right? Like it'll take the concrete too long to set. There's all sorts of reasons why we rush to get things done. Is very dictated by the current like other systems and economies that are built now, right? Like that are the status quo now. That doesn't really like intuitively, it doesn't make sense, right? Like it's gonna last a century. Or like the main reason for building demolition now isn't because the building has met its end of life, right? It's just because there are economies that say, oh, it'll be worth more if you build something taller, right? And it's like some of that stuff, it doesn't quite make sense in the full picture. And I think a part of this, like doing these studies and crunching the numbers, it's not necessarily like the output is not the number itself, but it's to try and see the world for what it is and like try to have a more holistic view and hopefully like rationale and logic will use that data to make better decisions. I'm not sure that practicality always works out, but that's the hope.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, let's stay on this sort of philosophical point. I know, Shika, you had a question you wanted to ask about this.
Oh, yeah. Especially given that we've all worked in sort of consulting firms and how we're sort of looked at in AEC as having a lot of, sustainability knowledge and trying to move the needle forward. I was just thinking, how do you think about your role or the role of corporations like ours in policy and systems related to climate change, especially, in influencing the policy realm or the finance realm? Yeah, what responsibility do we have as kind of an industry to the greater clocks that we're all paying attention to that Awe, I think, greatly
Wow,
explained.
Shika, that's a tough question. No, I think it's an interesting question because I don't know if there is no right answer, right? It's very philosophical. And in my view, like I think again it comes down to people. Like so much of this comes down to people and connection and social norms. And one thing I was, reflecting on, we got a question in our presentation. It's like, oh, what about, people cheating baselines for when they're doing the analysis? I'm like, that is a totally valid question. And at some point it's like, you know, we can't we have to fall back on our like common values to some degree, which are maybe it's hard to like define those. But at some point, like for structural engineering, you get pushed back and you can say, okay, well, the physics, it'll fall down, right? And at some point with this, it's like the physics are also there. Like the numbers we know pretty well, and we know we shouldn't be doing this. And right now it's hard because I feel like there isn't always like first movers get penalized, right? Like if you're going to say, I'm not going to build a project, there's plenty of people who will say, we'll build that project better. And there's a really dangerous narrative, I think, about that within any of our consulting, firms. And at some point, there is like a reality that the carbon emissions are going to continue to exacerbate climate change and the risks will continue to get worse. And so at what point is it just like us on a human level saying this is not acceptable anymore, and it's more of that social change, which is really where I feel like I not only I think it has the most influence, but I think it's also the most enjoyable. Like Awe know, like he's always a regular at our CLFLA events. Like it trying to build community and understanding of the topic and just talking about it and saying, this is reasonable, this isn't reasonable, and trying to shift that culture, I think is a big piece. And I mean, all of our big companies are doing this, right? Like people have made commitments. We know we need to change. And now we're at the point where it's like the rubber's meeting the road. We have to actually kind of act on that, right? And
Yeah,
it gets sticky. There's always going to
Yeah.
be a messy kind of gray area. And that's where I guess it also is somewhat interesting.
yeah, absolutely. Let's continue that. So, this is, I think, for folks in this industry who are listening, like, yeah, you're right. I think it's important that we push against the norms and the earlier you mentioned, Luke, like a lot of projects are dictated by cost and schedule. Like we could push against that and also like normalize a lot of these conversations and bringing structural engineers with materials folks and talking about all of asking questions related to embodied carbon and thinking about that. But what about folks who aren't quite in this industry, everyday folks, because like they hear embodied carbon, they're now thinking like, wow, like we've built a lot. There's a lot of concrete everywhere. Like, is there any way they can really interact with this in their daily lives or practices? And like, is there any relationship there for everyday folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same concepts can apply on the personal scale. I mean, it's something I reflect on as an individual, right? I try to buy more reuse, try to kind of, it gets to some degree, it gets to a consumption level. And the other thing, we've talked a lot about carbon with this. And for me, carbon is sort of like an initial thread and it opens the door. It's more of like supply chain, right? Which maybe even has less good branding, but it's like, okay, where's this stuff coming from? So, I feel like there are similar movements in like avoiding fast fashion or like buying local food or like those things that I mean those same concepts apply in our individual purchasing decisions, moving circularity. There's a number of companies that are starting up of like interior circularity, like companies like Reaply or Receipt, Canoa, like are dollars are a form of speech, right? And so I think that's where we can apply these same concepts and kind of just thinking about, yeah, I don't want to buy things that, I know are tied to forced labor. And I want to do my best to kind of have wide eyes to that, right? I also don't want to bury my head to just say, I don't know where this is coming from, but this is fun. Like, yeah, I really like this chocolate or whatever it is. Like, that's where I think the same concepts apply, and it's more of just having that kind of curiosity of understanding where things come from and trying to avoid where things are going. Actually, sorry about that. Uh, the other thing I really wanted to talk about, and we haven't talked about either, is more on the like regeneration side. Like, one thing that I've found really inspiring lately is I've gotten involved with the California Straw Bale Association. I gave a little talk about like the California CalGreen policy at their conference and got connected with them. And I signed up on their newsletter, and now I get events, and they have lots of volunteer events. And we haven't talked about it, but nature-based materials, things like, wood is something that's touted a lot as a carbon storing material, biogenic material. But some things like straw and hemp, things that are fast growing and can grow fast, and then you store that carbon in them for the life of the material. So things like that can be a carbon sink, and reframing that of taking our buildings from carbon sources to carbon sinks, I think is really inspiring. But the thing that I found most like enjoyable and great is just a really interesting community aspect to it. Like, I did this straw build. It was with Verdant structural engineers and Arcantil architects up in Ashland, Oregon. And it was the first straw bale, like multi-family townhouse. And there were probably like 40 people who showed up for this bale raising. And there was just like, in our traditional like senses of how we build, it's like you'd never be able to, like, it doesn't pencil cost wise, right, to have that much labor working on something like hauling straw bales, cutting them into place. And then after that weekend there was also another work session on clay plastering, which is much slower, takes more manual labor, but there's this aspect of community and being next to your neighbors that I think is very much part of the solution and not part of the like problem of cost or schedule or whatever. It's just like, that's where I find a lot of inspiration. So whether people are builders or not, I say get involved with some of those groups. Check out Casbah. Like, they're just genuinely enjoyable people, and it's just like a fun thing to be around. And I think it again draws that thread of connection with people and hope in action, right? Like, just getting your hands dirty and actually doing something that is better for the world.
Oh yeah, this is awesome, and I wish we could definitely talk more. Also, I love this connection with community too, and it makes our relationship to the materials and the places that we build and live more real, realer. Not just that, but also like enhancing and building that sense of community resilience, and also thinking about connection to like what a truly sustainable economic system looks like. And there's a lot there. Yeah, Jake, is there anything else?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I also love the community thread, and I always say it can be sometimes dejecting to work in this space in the sense of, you're putting so much effort into various initiatives and not always seeing, I guess, them working out on the timescales that we think we need to meet some of the demands of climate. But then you hear about stories like this where people are sort of coming together and overcoming maybe our traditional norms around how we function as a society, even though, historically and in a lot of other cultures, that aspect of community has been very much present throughout. But I feel like the stories of community, of getting together with folks, talking about these issues, whether they're inner industry or not, or meeting other people, like, that's definitely the fuel to keep going on this work and realizing we have so much power and collective kind of energy that is available to use and to continue the, work on climate. And so I got very excited by the whole idea of all of us building together, these
You should
embodied.
I did. They have a number of like builds around the Bay Area too. I definitely recommend you.
Cool.
Well, the first one I went to was like a hempcrete build, and it was in San Rafael, just north of the Bay. So you should definitely
Nice.
check it out. But yeah, and I totally agree, Ale. It's like the like thinking about our economic systems and how to make it work, right? I know, I think while you're at BH still, we worked on this or had published the New York City Green Economy Plan, right?
Yeah.
Which is really cool. And I mean, circularity was definitely a piece of that too, right? Like there's workforce development and I mean also the network of people that are required to make the logistics of that work are also really interesting. Like you need a whole ecosystem of businesses to make circular building systems work. And part of that is linked to the New York City also just published circular design guidelines. Is the first that I've seen in the US. I think, we probably have something to learn from Europe on that. But we're doing a project using those guidelines. And one of the things that I found most interesting so far was like, part of them requires what's called a circularity audit. Like you need to go to site, you got to walk around and you see what's important and what do you think is valuable, right? And one of my like biggest reflections on that was the just in doing that kind of exercise, right? Like literally being there and seeing it, like you start in talking to the people who work in those buildings, it's like you see it and you start to understand it a bit, you get a bit of the history, and it becomes so much harder to throw that away and just attribute zero value to that, right? So I'm really excited about that. And there's the thread of like historic preservation too in that. Like there's culture built, it's embodied culture, right? Like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and I think there's like an aspect there of like just maintaining history of a place and people and what it means to be like in that community, where again it's like the solution is part of, it's not just one problem that we're trying to solve. And if we're just trying to solve carbon, like we're lost, right? But it's all these other aspects that societally we also, I feel like, are just, there's a wanting for something better, right? Like we got to build something that works better for us, and these solutions I think are well aligned with those desires, I'd say.
Oh yeah, heck yeah, and I love that. Like the explanation or like use the term embodied culture,
Yeah.
and I don't think we think enough about that relationship. There is that really it does and like the only thing that we don't have to talk about this, and I'll wrap us up in a second, but I can't help this, and this is not to get too political. Whenever I see like internationally like bombings happening to different communities or towns and neighborhoods that are being bombed, and the buildings and the infrastructure that's being lost, of course, first and foremost is like loss of life. That's really tragic, but I also think about like the embodied carbon that has gone into building these buildings and what they mean for communities, whether it's a church or a mosque or a school or a hospital, and it's like that's gone. And not only is that energy and carbon gone, but also like what that meant for that community, and that the loss of that, and I think we can bring it back to even just here in the US and thinking about what we've chosen to give our land to. I think a lot in the transportation world, a lot of land goes to parking and road,
Mm.
and
It's what we
transportation.
value.
That's what
we
we valued,
it's we're
and
showing what we value with what we build. Yeah.
exactly. And earlier you mentioned
Mm.
what we've built is a reflection of what we really value, and I
Yeah.
can't help but there's so much connection there. I think it's important that we think about this and we approach our our journey to a more sustainable future with all these connections in mind.
Yeah.
And so, with that, I just want to say, Luke, thanks so much. Like, I feel like we could talk about each of these points levels deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully it was good
Go.
surface.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is like a hell of a like reflection to end on a way, like, and it brings up a lot, the loss of buildings is one thing, but there's like so much, yeah, trauma like associated with
Mm.
that. And the care, a lot of times I feel like we're almost like attracted to the shiny object of some new, like you're saying, some new technology or whatever, something new. Like I see these visions of creating a new city somewhere, and it's like it's such it for me. It represents such a distraction because it's so much harder to like repair and rebuild and maintain. And so like yeah, on the back of that like damage, there's so much work that comes from having to rebuild not just the buildings but the community. And yeah, I think Yeah, there's a lot that we could dig into there, but that work of maintenance and yeah, there's this book, All We Can Save. I don't know if either of you read it yet, but I really like,
Great
and
book.
it's one thing that they have these really nice graphics that really stick with me. Like there's one that is just, it's like stitching of a patch, and it's like, what beautiful work to like maintain this it's not product. That sounds way too
Yeah.
economical, but it's like it's such beautiful work to like maintain something rather than like just build new, or just like technology will save us. And like the repair, both like at a community and material level, I think is part of where future and salvation sounds way too biblical, but I think there's a lot of valuable work, and I've definitely enjoyed it with the people I've met. Awe, always enjoy chatting with you, and definitely shout out to all my CLF peeps. So get involved with us, come join us, and it's a really nice group and lots of good work to be done.
Awesome. Thanks, Luke. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love how much this conversation has touched on imagination and imagining a world where we all come together and we see the stories of our materials, the stories of our built environment, and want to maintain those stories as well as the stories of ourselves and our community. And that, yeah, there's just such a nice thread of, keeping stories alive that comes with the circular economy, and thinking more about how we live in the world and how it was produced, and similarly how we are products of it, but also still, part of the solution, and the symbiosis that I think you mentioned in that all you can save kind of imagery.
We are part of it, but we also have agency within that piece, right?
Right. So I feel very, very hopeful about the future of climate, community, and embodied carbon within it all.
Cool.
I love it.
Super fun to chat with both of you. Thank you so much for having me. And Awe, let me know if you want to grab coffee.
Heck yes. All right, folks, that's it for this episode of Fostering Our Earth. I hope that as you move through the world around you now, you'll think about the embodied carbon of the various things that we own and in the built environment around us. Everything has embodied carbon, and it's reflective of our own consumerist and capitalistic cultures. Luke shared ways for us to design smarter, introduce low carbon materials, and suggested policies that change how we use and reuse parts of our built environment. As always, I encourage you to continue diving deeper. Check out organizations like the Carbon Leadership Forum, like Luke suggested, wherever you are, or maybe tour your own local cement plant and see how cement gets made. There are links to all the different resources and books that we recommended in the show notes below. Don't forget to follow Fostering Our Earth on Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the newsletter on Substack. Keep fostering your Earth today for a better future tomorrow. Thanks, y'all, and talk soon.